My name is Elise Corbin. I am 36 years old. And when I walked out of my mother's dining room last Sunday evening, the only thing I could feel was the cold weight of my car keys pressing into my thigh through my coat pocket. The bruise they left was still visible 3 days later, a faint purple line where the teeth of the key had dug in while I stood perfectly still and let my family finish saying what they had apparently been rehearsing. Let me tell you how we got there. Before I take you back to where this started, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Because I remember exactly what time it was the night everything changed. It was 6:47 on a Sunday evening. Some moments don't just stay in your memory, they burn the clock into it. I need to go back 11 months. That is where the wait begins. I grew up in a house outside Dayton, where my mother, Jeanette, ran everything and everyone with the pleasant efficiency of someone who believed love was a scheduling problem. My father left when I was 4. My sister Margot was 2. Mom remarried when I was 9. Our stepfather Dale was a building contractor who spoke carefully, laughed loudly, and had a way of entering a room that made you feel like the furniture had been rearranged to make space for him. Dale had a son from his first marriage, Connor, who was 7 years older than me and already living with his mother when Dale moved in. Connor appeared on alternating weekends and holidays, quiet and watchful, eating whatever was placed in front of him and leaving before the dishes were done. By the time I was in high school, Connor was gone almost entirely. He resurfaced after college and slowly became the person Dale talked about most. Connor had started a commercial flooring company. Connor had landed a municipal contract. Connor had bought a house before 30. Dale's pride in Connor had a particular quality to it, the kind that needed an audience. He told the same stories at every gathering, adjusting the numbers upward each time, and nobody corrected him because nobody wanted to be the person who interrupted Dale when he was feeling generous. I became a fire protection engineer. That is not a profession people bring up at dinner parties, and I never minded. My work involved designing, inspecting, and certifying the suppression and alarm systems that keep commercial buildings from killing the people inside them. Sprinkler hydraulics, egress modeling, code compliance, detection system verification. I spent my days reading architectural drawings the way other people read menus, scanning for what was missing before I noticed what was there. The training rewired something in me permanently. I did not look at a room and see furniture. I looked at a room and saw ignition sources, combustible loads, exit paths, and the distance between a human body and the nearest means of escape. That skill had kept buildings honest for 14 years. It was about to do something far less comfortable to my own family. The Christmas dinner call happened on a Tuesday in late January, 11 months before the Sunday I walked out of that dining room. Mom phoned me during my lunch break. I was sitting in my truck outside a strip mall in Kettering, where I had just finished a quarterly inspection, eating a gas station sandwich, and reviewing deficiency photos on my tablet. Mom's voice had the particular brightness she used when she wanted something to sound like an invitation rather than an assignment. She told me she and Dale were hosting Christmas dinner at their house this year, and she wanted to start planning early, 11 months early. That should have been the first signal, but I was still holding a sandwich and thinking about a fire damper that had been painted shut on the 3rd floor of a medical office building. Then she said the rest. Dale thought it would be wonderful if the whole family contributed to Connor's new venture. Connor was expanding his flooring business into a second location, and Dale wanted the family to show support by helping fund the build-out. Mom said she and Dale were contributing. Margot had already agreed, and they were hoping I would cover the permits, inspections, and insurance costs for the new space. She mentioned a number, $31,000. I stopped chewing. My hand found the edge of the steering wheel and held it. I did not speak for several seconds. The tablet on my passenger seat still showed a photograph of the painted shut damper, frozen mid-zoom on the bolts someone had buried under 3 coats of latex. I stared at that image while something inside me went very still, not angry, not confused, just counting. $31,000 for permits and insurance on a commercial build-out that I had not been consulted about, had not seen plans for, and had no professional involvement in. For a stepbrother I saw twice a year at holidays, where he barely spoke to me, I said, "That's a lot of money, Mom." She said, "Dale says it's what family does." I told her I would think about it. I finished my sandwich. I drove to my next inspection, but something had already shifted, not dramatically. More like the sound a structure makes when a load-bearing element has been compromised, and the weight begins transferring to members that were never designed to carry it. You do not hear a crack, you hear a settling, a groan so low it registers in your hands before your ears. The history behind that phone call stretched back decades, though I had never arranged it into a single narrative until later. When I was 19 and working part-time through my engineering program, Dale asked me to co-sign a truck loan for Connor. Mom said it would help Connor build credit. I co-signed. Connor made payments for 5 months, then stopped. I covered the remaining 14 months myself because my name was on the paper and I could not afford the default. Dale never mentioned it again. When I brought it up at Thanksgiving that year, he said Connor had hit a rough patch and that families absorbed those things. When I was 24 and had just started my first real engineering position, Dale asked if I could lend Connor $12,000 to cover equipment for a flooring job that would supposedly pay for itself within weeks. Mom handed me the phone. Connor's voice was flat and businesslike. He said he would pay me back within 60 days. I transferred the money. 60 days passed, then 90, then a year. When I finally asked Dale directly, he told me Connor had reinvested the money into the business and that I should think of it as an investment in the family. I never saw a dollar returned. The irony is that I spent every working day inspecting systems designed to protect people from invisible failures, blocked sprinkler heads, disabled alarms, emergency exits chained shut to prevent theft. I could walk into a building I had never seen before and identify within minutes whether the systems designed to save lives were actually functional or just decorative. And the entire time I was living inside a family where the same principle applied, and I refused to test it. By the time Mom called about the $31,000, the pattern had been running for 17 years. The truck loan, the $12,000, smaller amounts folded into holidays and birthdays, a few hundred here for Connor's daughter's school costs, $1,000 there for a piece of equipment Dale said Connor needed. I had never totaled it. I had never written it down. I had treated each request as an isolated event because that was how they were always presented, and because keeping a ledger on your own family felt like something a person did when love had already failed. I said I would think about it. What I actually did was something I had never done before. I opened a spreadsheet. Not because I had decided anything yet, because I was an engineer, and when something does not feel right structurally, you pull the drawings. That spreadsheet became the first document. I started with what I could verify from my own bank records and worked backward through years of transfers, checks, and cash withdrawals I could trace to specific requests. The numbers assembled themselves with the calm indifference numbers always have. They did not care what I had been told the money was for. They only showed where it went. But the spreadsheet was just the frame. What it could not show me was whether the $31,000 Mom had quoted bore any relationship to reality. Permit costs and inspection fees for a commercial build-out are not mysterious. They are public. They are filed with municipal offices, and they follow predictable formulas based on square footage, occupancy classification, and scope of work. I knew this because calculating those costs was part of what I did professionally. So I pulled the address Mom had mentioned for Connor's new location and submitted a public records request for the permit applications. The first document that came back was a building permit application filed under Connor's company name. The total project valuation listed on the application was $87,000. That number mattered because permit fees in that jurisdiction were calculated as a percentage of declared project value. Based on the filing, the permit and inspection costs should have been roughly $4,200, not $31,000. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with the permit application on my screen and the spreadsheet beside it. The gap between $4,200 and $31,000 was not a rounding error. It was not an honest mistake made by someone unfamiliar with construction costs. It was a number designed for someone who would not check, delivered by people who assumed I had no reason to. I requested more records. Over the next 3 weeks, working evenings after my inspections were done, I assembled everything the municipal office had on file for Connor's original location and his new build-out. Then I did something I had been trained to do since my first year in fire protection work. I compared the official documents against what I had been told. Layer by layer, the structure revealed itself. The permits for the new location had already been paid. Connor had filed and paid them months before Mom ever called me. The $31,000 was not for permits and insurance. It was a fabricated number attached to a legitimate-sounding category because Dale knew I worked in the industry and would recognize the terminology. He had chosen the one-cost category I would associate with my own expertise, betting that familiarity would substitute for verification. And that was what I was carrying when I walked into that dining room 11 months later. But I was not done yet. The second layer surfaced when I cross-referenced Connor's business filings with the county recorder's office. The new location was not a second branch, it was a replacement. Connor's original location had lost its primary municipal contract 8 months earlier due to a failed performance review. The expansion story was a cover for a contraction. Dale had been telling the family Connor was growing when Connor was actually collapsing. The third layer went deeper than Connor. I pulled my own bank records going back to the truck loan when I was 19 and matched every transfer I had ever made on Connor's behalf against his company's public filings. Over 17 years, I had given or lent Connor and Dale a combined total exceeding $74,000. Not $1 had ever been documented as a loan. Not $1 had been repaid. And in Connor's company filings from 4 years earlier, I found a capital contribution entry that matched, almost to the dollar, the $12,000 I had lent him at 24. He had reported my personal loan as owner equity. He had used my money to inflate the value of his company on paper. Then came the fourth layer, and this was the one that made everything before it feel like background noise. I found it because of the permit application. The building permit for Connor's new location listed a general contractor. I recognized the company name. It was Dale's. Dale's contracting firm was the general contractor on his own son's build-out, which meant Dale was billing Connor's company for construction work. When I pulled the invoices through a public lien search, the general contractor's billing on the project totaled $63,000. The project valuation on the permit application was $87,000. Dale was billing his own son's company for 72% of the total project cost, on a job where the permits had already been paid and the build-out was mostly cosmetic. The invoice format looked legitimate. Correct letterhead, itemized labor, material line items with unit costs. But the author field in the document properties showed a name that was not Dale's. It showed Connor's. Connor had created the invoices that were supposedly billing him. Father and son were cycling money between their companies, using inflated invoices, and the $31,000 they wanted from me was not funding a build-out. It was filling a gap their own paper trail had created. I sat at my kitchen table at 10:30 on a Wednesday night with the invoice metadata glowing on my screen. My coffee had gone cold hours earlier. The heating vent above the stove clicked on and off in its usual rhythm. I did not move for a long time. Something in me had become perfectly still, the way a structure goes still in the seconds after a critical member fails and before the load finds somewhere else to go. I was not angry, I was running calculations I had not asked myself to run. Now let me tell you about the Sunday. Dale and Mom hosted what they called a year-end family dinner. Their dining room had been remodeled the previous spring, Dale's own work, with a long walnut table he had built himself, and overhead lighting he talked about the way some men talk about boats. That room was Dale's monument. He seated people strategically, always taking the head, always gesturing toward the joinery when someone new visited. He had once told a neighbor that the table could seat 14. The neighbor had 6 in his family. The number was not about chairs, it was about scale. Margot was there with her husband Paul. Connor sat near Dale with his wife Steph. Aunt Linda, Mom's sister, had driven from Pica. Margot's 2 kids were in the living room with a movie playing too loud through the wall. I arrived last, which was unlike me. I had always been the person who came early and helped set the table. This time, I walked in after everyone was seated and placed a thin manila folder beside my water glass before sitting down. Nobody noticed the folder. That was fine. I was not ready yet. Dinner moved through its usual rhythm. Dale talked about the business. Mom refilled glasses. Margot's husband asked Connor about the new location, and Connor answered with the rehearsed confidence of someone who had told the story enough times to believe it. He described the expansion, the new contracts he expected, the square footage, the timeline. Dale beamed. Mom watched Dale beam. The room operated exactly as it had been designed to, everyone facing the man at the head of the table, reflecting his version of events back to him. After the main course, Dale stood up. He liked to make small speeches at family dinners. He thanked Mom for the meal, mentioned something about the year being strong, and then turned to me. He said he and Mom had been hoping I had reconsidered the family contribution to Connor's build-out. He said it warmly, as though reminding me of a shared plan I had simply forgotten to execute. I opened the folder. The first thing I placed on the table was a printout of the building permit application, showing that the permit and inspection fees totaled $4,200, not $31,000. I set it between my plate and Dale's and said, "The permits were already paid." Dale glanced at the paper and said I was confused about the scope. I placed the second document beside it, the capital contribution filing from Connor's company showing my $12,000 reported as owner equity. I told the table what it was. Connor shifted in his chair and said the accounting had been handled by his bookkeeper and that it was probably a clerical error. Steph looked at Connor, then at the document, then at the tablecloth. Dale said I was turning a family dinner into an audit. I placed the third item, the invoice metadata printout showing that the document billed to Connor's company by Dale's contracting firm had been authored by Connor himself. On Connor's computer, 3 weeks before the invoice date, Dale said, "Elise, this is not the place." Mom said my name the way she always said it when she wanted me to stop, before Dale became uncomfortable. Soft, measured, with a rising note at the end that meant please. Dale told the table that I had always resented Connor's success and that this was jealousy dressed up as accounting. Margot looked at the documents, then at me. She did not speak, but her hand stopped moving toward her wine glass and stayed flat on the table. Dale said he had given everything to this family, and that questioning his integrity in his own home was something he would not tolerate. Connor said I had clearly gone through records I had no right to access. Everything I had pulled was public. I told him that. Then Aunt Linda spoke. Linda had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen. She was a retired municipal clerk who had spent 31 years processing building permits, contractor licenses, and lien filings for Butler County. Dale had never thought about what Linda did for a living, because Dale had never thought about Linda at all. She was Mom's older sister, a woman who showed up to family events with a dish no one asked for and left before dessert. Linda said she had reviewed commercial permit applications for 3 decades and that the numbers on my printout were consistent with standard fee schedules. She said the valuation discrepancy between the permit filing and the invoiced contractor costs would have been flagged automatically in her office. Then she looked at Dale and said something that silenced the room. She said she had seen the original permit application when it was filed because Butler County's system still cross-referenced contractor license numbers, and Dale's license had appeared on a filing she processed before she retired. She had noticed the project valuation seemed low for the described scope, but had assumed it was a phased project. Now she understood why. Dale's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. He started to speak, stopped, and looked at Connor. Connor was staring at the table. Steph had pushed her chair back slightly, as though preparing to stand without knowing where she would go. I looked at Dale. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I said it the way I would note a failed inspection item on a deficiency report. You didn't ask for help. You designed a billing cycle and called it family. I did not say another word. The folder remained on the table. Dale's walnut table, the one he built, the one that seated 14, the one he gestured toward whenever he wanted someone to understand the kind of man he was. The documents sat on its surface like items entered into evidence, which in a way they were. Margot was the one who moved first. She picked up the metadata printout and read it again, slowly. Paul leaned over her shoulder. Connor still had not looked up. Dale told everyone I had manufactured a crisis and that a real conversation would happen privately. Nobody responded to him. The room had shifted, and he could feel it, the same way you feel the air pressure change in a corridor when a fire door fails to hold. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They settled, the way structural loads redistribute after a failure. Slowly at first, then with the grinding inevitability of weight finding its true path. Within 2 weeks, Margot called me. She had gone back through her own records. Over the years, Dale had asked her and Paul for smaller contributions, always framed as investments in Connor's business. Their total came to just over $19,000, none of it documented, none repaid. Paul, who worked in commercial lending, made 3 phone calls and confirmed that the routing number on one of Connor's repayment promises did not match any account in Connor's name. It matched Dale's personal account. Connor's wife, Steph, filed for legal separation in February. I heard this from Margot, not from Connor. Steph had apparently been unaware of the invoice arrangement and had believed the build-out was funded through a legitimate business loan. The metadata printout had not just revealed a billing fraud. It had shown her that her husband and his father had been collaborating on financial deception inside a marriage she thought was transparent. The permit filing discrepancies I had identified were enough to trigger a routine audit. Dale's company had 2 active projects when the review began. Both clients requested independent cost verification within the same month. One terminated the contract outright. Connor's flooring company lost the replacement municipal bid he had been counting on. The failed performance review from his original contract was now being cited in new evaluations. Without the inflated capital structure my money had helped create on paper, his company's financial position looked materially different to the bonding company that underwrote his municipal work. The bond was not renewed. Mom called me in April. Her voice sounded older than her age. She did not mention the documents or the dinner or Dale's reaction. She asked if I remembered the summer I was 12 when she taught me to read a tape measure in the garage. I told her I did. She said she wished we could go back there. I said we could not, but I told her I still answered when she called, and I meant it. Margot completed an arc I had not anticipated. At the dinner she had been silent. In January, she admitted privately that she had suspected the numbers were wrong for years, but had told herself Dale was simply optimistic, not dishonest. By February, she had pulled her own records and understood the scope. In March, she told Mom she would no longer attend any gathering where the financial arrangements were treated as settled or where Dale's version of events was repeated without challenge. In April, she called me and apologized. She said she had watched me carry the family's invisible work for years and had let herself believe I did it because I wanted to, not because no one else would. The apology was real. It also left something open between us, because she had known longer than she admitted, and both of us understood that. Dale and Mom's marriage did not end, but it contracted. Mom moved into the guest bedroom for several weeks in the spring. Dale's contracting business lost a 3rd client by summer. He began taking smaller residential jobs, the kind he had spent 20 years telling people he was too established for. The walnut dining table still seated 14, but by fall, most gatherings happened in the kitchen instead. I did not orchestrate any of it. I had placed documents on a table and told the truth. The consequences were not revenge. They were the weight that had always existed, finally landing on the structure that created it instead of the one that had been absorbing it. The thing I rebuilt was quieter than the thing I lost. For years, I had postponed my professional certification in fire investigation, the advanced credential that would have let me move from protection engineering into forensic fire analysis. I had postponed it because every spare weekend and every spare dollar kept getting redirected towards someone else's emergency. Dale's requests, Mom's expectations, the invisible labor of keeping a family running that never once asked me what I was putting off to keep showing up. In the spring, I enrolled in the program. I studied at my kitchen table with the same focus I had once used to trace Connor's invoices, except now the documents in front of me were mine. I sat for the exam in September. I passed. The certification letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I read it once, set it on the counter, and made coffee. Then I read it again. Margot sent flowers. Mom called and asked what the certification meant in practice. I explained it, and she listened, which was more than she had done in years when I talked about my work. Dale did not call. I did not expect him to. There is something I have learned about silence. Not the silence of a quiet room, but the silence of a family that watches something happen and says nothing. That silence is not neutral, it is structural, it carries load. Every year someone looked at the numbers and said nothing. Every holiday, someone heard Dale's version and nodded along. Every request I fulfilled without anyone asking whether the last one had been repaid. All of that silence accumulated in the same place. It accumulated in me. I was the member designed to bear whatever the rest of the structure could not hold. And for years, I held it because I believed that was what holding a family together looked like. What I did not understand until I opened that spreadsheet was that the silence had a direction. It always moved toward the person willing to carry it and away from the person who created it. Breaking that direction cost me Dale's affection, months of strained calls with Mom, and a version of family that I had once mistaken for love. What it gave me was a foundation I could actually stand on. Not because I punished anyone, because I stopped pretending the load was distributed when it never had been. Consequences are not revenge. They are what was always owed. The invoices, the inflated filings, the unreturned money, none of that was created by the evening I placed a folder on Dale's walnut table. It was created by 17 years of silence that allowed the pattern to continue. All I did was stop being the quiet in the room. Last Sunday evening, almost a year after that dinner, I drove to a building on the east side of Dayton where I was conducting my first independent fire investigation as a newly certified analyst. The building was a small commercial warehouse. No one was hurt. The cause was electrical. I documented everything methodically, took my photographs, and wrote my notes in the truck before leaving. My car keys sat in my coat pocket, pressing lightly against my thigh. I felt them there and remembered. The last time I had been this aware of keys against my leg, I had been standing in Dale's dining room, holding myself perfectly still, while my family decided whether to believe what was on the table or the man at its head. I started the engine. The warehouse was quiet behind me, its suppression system having done exactly what it was designed to do. Something had failed, and the systems in place had contained it. No one needed to be a hero. The protection just needed to work. I drove home with the windows cracked, cold air threading through the cab. On my passenger seat sat the certification folder I still carried to every job site. Inside it, clipped to the front page, was the deficiency photograph from the strip mall inspection I had been reviewing the day Mom first called about the $31,000. The painted shut fire damper. I had kept it as a reminder, not of my family, of what it looks like when someone seals off the one thing designed to protect a building and then paints over it so no one can tell. I parked in my driveway and sat for a moment. The house was dark and waiting, and mine. Inside, there was coffee to make and notes to finish, and a morning that would arrive with work I had chosen and earned. Nobody was expecting me to organize anything. Nobody was expecting me to pay for anything. Nobody was expecting me at all, which turned out to be exactly the condition under which I could finally decide where I wanted to be.